reason when I say this out loud, it's okay. It sounds horrible. Is I live with my mom, and then everyone and the special interests make fun of that, right? It's like, but like if I live with my dad, no one would make fun of me for that. I think there's something about that. But the reality is, I live with my mom in San Jose because the average home price when you look at Zillow today is like $1.6 million to just live down the street from me. So how can I afford even the 20% down payment? You probably saw in the news that we put in the state budget a program to help people pay for their down payment. And that program ran out of money in 11 days. In 11 days. And that was magnitude of millions of dollars, which of course, as you can imagine, because houses are expensive, we're only able to help so many people. And that's especially the case in the Bay Area, right? It is so expensive to live in our community, the communities we grew up in, we cherish, and we made successful. And we were denying not just future generations or younger people, but people of all ages, the opportunity to stay here. And I think that's a real travesty and a real double-edged sword of our success. So it's really important to me that we're tackling housing affordability and, of course, its most ugly symptom is homelessness, trying to make sure that people are housed. I'll tell you that I sit on the budget committee, and much of my focus on being on budgets of 4 now is tackling homelessness and putting money efficiently where it is. I know a lot of folks get very frustrated when you hear that we spend billions and billions of dollars on homelessness, yet the rate at which people, actually the raw number of people who become homeless is growing. And why is that the case? It's a very simple fact, is that in Santa Clara County, at this moment, for every 1 person we rehouse, approximately 1.7 people become homeless. Now that number was a lot worse like 5 years ago, 6 years ago. But of course, that means a real amount of people who live on the streets is increasing, which is unacceptable. We live in the 4th largest economy in the world, and Santa Clara County alone is probably like the GDP and the population of a small European country, advanced European country. But we are the capital as a state, capital of homelessness in the world, and the United Nations has called it a humanitarian crisis. And homelessness, of course, is a humanitarian, ethical, fiscal, and policy problem that we must confront as quickly as possible. And my kind of talk to a lot of neighbors always is like, we can't lose faith in the approach. It is working, just like we're bending the curve. You know, when we talk about COVID, it's bending the curve, but it's not bending it fast enough. And we know the real cure to homelessness is one thing, the home, right? Obviously, how people stay housed or fall into homelessness can be a lot of different things, but we need to make sure that we're spending efficiently and doing things to make sure people can get housed, stay housed, and get the support they need. And the real problem right now, because cost of living is so high, that there are so many people falling into homelessness. And along the way, they might encounter behavioral problems, addiction problems, other problems that happen, health, just normal physical health problems that make everything worse. And it is so much more efficient from even just a fiscal standpoint to prevent someone from being homeless in the first place than trying to rehouse people. And to that end, I have a lot of different housing bills, but the signature bill that I work on a lot, and I'm the chair of this select committee on social housing, is social housing. It's the idea that we as a state should build affordable housing ourselves for all income levels, not just concentration of poverty, not just for wealthy enclaves, but everyone of every walk of life should do this. And we're modeling it after 2 successful gold standards of international housing. Internationally, social housing is very commonly adopted in Europe and in Asia. In Vienna, which is a comparable to our county, is about 2 million people. The average salary there annually is $50,000. In the state, it's like less than $40,000 in the state. But their average rents there, $300 to $500 per rent. And their housing prices is way, way mitigated less because 60% of their residents live in social housing. And because 60%, the majority share of residents live in social housing, the market also cannot climb too high. Because as a rational consumer, why would I pay more for a comparable unit and comparable living standard on the private market? I get all the choices. And that's really the wonderful thing there. And I recently went there on a delegation with California policymakers to Vienna to study this. And I'll say is that they've had 100 years of success. Though, of course, Austria is much more politically, much more left-leaning. And in contrast, which I'm going to take a delegation to this September, is we're going to go to Singapore. Singapore, famously the land of crazy rich Asians, right? A lot of skyscrapers, but also heavy embracers of social housing. 80% of the residents live in social housing there. And in fact, the prime minister used to live in social housing up until they were like, you gotta live in the presidential house now. We have to move you. But it is also a highly capitalist society, very heterogeneous society of different cultures. and actually kind of socially conservative. In fact, they only just recently decriminalized sodomy. So congratulations to them over there. But both spectrums of why I do it is both political spectrums have embraced social housing. To say that just as we do in this country, to think about this, right? Any child born in California and America, really, every child that's born, we know for a fact that they will have a seat at school. Isn't that crazy? Like we just know that. We don't have to means test it. We don't have to apply to anything. We know at the end of the day, one way or the other, they will go to school. We do that. So whether they're rich or poor, they get to go to a public school, public university. Rich or poor, people get to drive on our public roads. Rich or poor, you drink from the state aqueduct project. All these things we take for granted, things that we care about as universal goods. And yet we don't do that with housing. We say that certain people who meet certain criteria, especially times that keep people poor, can only live in public housing, can only do this. But the idea that's embraced universally in other countries and developed democracies, well, not so much in Singapore, they're not so much of democracy, but the developed countries, I should say, is that this is universal good. It's good for the economy. It's good for society that everyone has a home. And in the fourth largest economy in the world, everyone ought to have a dignified home. And that's what we're trying to do. Try to move the window of possibility and trying to get us there to policies like that. In addition, I do things to also protect mobile home park residents, to protect residents, a lot of renters, a lot of different proposals. But also on the second issue that I work really hard on is electoral reform. And you might ask, why electoral reform? It seems kind of niche, right? But at the heart of it, if you want to pass bold climate change policy, make sure that housing is affordable, we have to even the odds of our post-Citizens United world of politics, where money is unfortunately classified as speech. It has empowered special interests, especially greedy corporations, to buy results. They can buy it as propositions, buy it from influenced politicians, I'll say, after we polite to everyone, but influence. So I have done several different bills. Like I'm currently working, especially with Craig, on this effort to get publicly financed elections in California. Did you know right now there is a ban in California for most cities, counties, in the state from having publicly financed election system? We have to, ironically, get it on the ballot in 2024 to lift that ban. It would allow more cities, counties, and even the state to adopt, say, democracy vouchers, matching fund systems. LA, San Francisco, Oakland, Berkeley, they have different systems out there. Even Seattle, very famously, even red states like Arizona have systems like this. It's a way to empower everyday folks like ourselves to not just vote for the candidates we like, but also to make sure they win, to even the odds. Because right now, as long as Citizens United stands, there's a lot of money out there, and the most rich and powerful people have a lot to burn. And just like in my case, $1.1 million was dropped in the bucket for them. They could have spent even more. That was just pittance money for them. But it means a lot that if you meet someone, a city council member, a state legislator, a county supervisor, candidate that you really like, and sometimes I know most people don't have a lot of disposable income to do it, but to say, hey, I'm going to support you. I'm going to put my democracy vouchers of $100 here. That'll buy you a couple more flyers. That'll get you a couple more ads maybe. But that stuff is good because we want to incentivize voter engagement in that sense, right? We probably hear a lot of times that politicians spend a lot of time doing call time, doing a lot of fundraising time. I'm not too good at that because I spend so much of my time working on my bills, but I should be because I'm on a cycle every 2 years. But you want to also incentivize that. Like if I'm door knocking someone and then there's also possibility to give me a democracy voucher, that's a great win-win. It's a great incentive. You want to align the incentives so that people will go and knock on doors. In Seattle, they've actually started we've talked to some candidates, they actually say like, well, it's actually a fiscal net positive if I knock on X amount of doors and I get an X amount of democracy vouchers, and that's good, right? We want more people to come out rather than just you go to your mailbox and you get 100 mailings or you just go on TV. That's not democracy. That's not our civic engagement anymore, but it's skewing that way. So we're hopefully going to do that. I also have a bill right now to ban foreign influence corporations from spending in elections in California. So they can't spend to ballot measures, to politicians, etc. Did you know that in 1982, 5% of all publicly traded corporations in the United States were owned by foreign actors, whether that be a Saudi oil prince, a London hedge firm, a Russian oligarch? That was 5% back then. Today, it's 40%. 1 in 4. Basically every single name brand you can recognize, from Chevron to Johnson & Johnson to whatever it is you can think of, Airbnb, they have a substantial controlling interest in a foreign actor right now. And the reality is, as we have globalized our markets, a lot of very rich and powerful interests, not just in this country, but in other places in the world, sometimes our adversaries like to park their money here. And you see this obviously manifest itself in the real estate market too, where they buy up properties, but it's quite a safe bet that, and it's funny, you see this is like the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia parks a lot of money in American fossil fuel corporations. And even with a 1% share, they have a guaranteed lifeline to the CEO. Now, you don't know what they talk about all the time, but that's influential in two ways. That way, now Russian money could be going to candidates over here who coincidentally, take very pro-oil stances or something like that. They will be funneling money that way. And secondly, is that influence, that control. They say, hey, this country is trying to crack down on oil drilling or whatever. You got to stop that. You got to stop that right now, right? Think about it in this sense. And I think someone wanted to talk about our favorite mega billionaire from who owns his own social media company now. Just think about when Twitter was failing and he was afraid that all investors would pull out. Elon Musk flew to the Qatari World Cup to meet with the Qataris, his Qatari investors, and his Saudi investors. Think about it. One of the richest men in the world flew across the world just to go, and he was photographed doing this, right? He's just to beg them not to pull their money out of Twitter. What kind of influence does that have, right? Now, especially on a platform that controls speech too, very influential. So we have to be on guard about our democracy in that sense, because the rules in which policymakers are chosen determines the kind of policies that are chosen too. And we have to be so cognizant of that. And that's why those are the two issues I put a lot of my effort in. Doesn't always make me the most popular person with all the politicians, right? We don't like to bite the hand that feeds often, but I think it's so important to do that. And I think we are having more and more people get elected that are reflective of our community. I don't like to just talk about people of color or young people, but people that are truly accountable to their communities, people who come up through their PTAs, or people who just said, wow, this issue has really screwed up my community, or the fact that, like in LA, oil wells are hundreds of feet away from schools and homes. That is still the fact today. And that is because of decades and decades of a lot of special interests, the rich and powerful, buying their way. And I think right now our democracy is at a standpoint that says greed is not acceptable. In fact, I'll share the last story before we go to Q&A. In fact, this time last year, inspired by Congressmember O'Connor, this time last year when oil prices shot up so high for the first time in 1 year, 2022, when it was like $7, $8 at that time, and fossil fuel companies are really price gouging us, I introduced a measure that was a windfall profit tax on oil companies to say that if you're profiting excessively, I'm going to take some of that profit back and give it back to people instead of just going back to your shareholders. And that was quickly, as you can imagine, killed pretty fast, but it was worth a try. And then in September, when they did it again, and this time it was a second price spike, our governor said, this is unacceptable. We're going to implement a windfall profits tax. And I think at that time when I heard it, my eyes bulged out. I was like, what? He took this policy. And that was amazing. And then since that time, September, till actually just March, last month, we worked on that bill. The bill changed a little bit, and it's now we have the first time in the nation a cap on their prices and an independent watchdog that actually monitors their behavior. Because a lot of times the oil industry will say, well, it's really high because of the war, because of this, just trust us. And then we say, hey, can you verify that math for us? They're like, no, no, just trust us. So this time we actually have an independent watchdog. We set the prices, and now hopefully going forward, they'll never be able to do those price spikes ever again. And just as a tidbit of a fact for you is that in the last 20 years, fossil fuel companies only spiked above 50 cents per barrel. Basically, their margin between getting crude oil and then refining and selling to us, the 50-cent margin. They only went above 50 cents 3 times. Once was in the Torrance oil refinery blew up, and then suddenly all oil prices stayed high, and twice in 1 year. And they want to say, oh, it's just all these fees that you put on us to be good to the environment. And I always told them, so our constant fees account for a acute change. And they're like, yeah. And I'm like, well, how's that mathematically work? Just trust us. Just trust. They literally go in front of committees and say, it's all the government's fault. You all want more solar power, you all want more wind, but what we know is fossil fuels here to stay. And they hate the fact that we're clamping down on that, right? But I was really proud that, that proposal, which sometimes a lot of my colleagues thought was impossible, was adopted by the governor because he saw the potential in it. and that became a law. We pushed it through last month. It was the subject of the extraordinary session, which we haven't had in many, many years. The single bill for the extraordinary session, and I was really proud to work on that. And that just goes to show is not just say my clout or something like that, but just that any individual can take up space for positive change. When I got here to the legislature, a lot of people are like, he's going to fail. He's going to get, people are going to unseat him in 2 years, 1 year. And there's still some people who still say that, right? They keep pinching themselves, hoping one day I will be unelected from office. But more and more, our agenda for the people is moving forward, a very progressive one, a very bold one, and it's about economics that works for everyone, and it is coming to fruition. So I feel like I ramble on and on enough, but I really do appreciate all the activism and work you all do here, and I know that together we can accomplish a lot in California. So thank you. So Bill, Craig, how should we do the Q&A? Oh, okay. David Donaldson, my favorite ex-constituent. I'm sorry.
The Republicans are worried about gun violence impacting their votes in upcoming elections, I read. And it occurred to me that the homeless, 25% of about are actually long-term needing medical care, mentally ill. The other 25% of homeless are mentally impacted in their thinking because they are homeless. So basically, the idea is that Reaganism brought us the end of, in California, end of care for mentally ill people. Now, why don't we bring that back?
Yeah.
That's an idea we want to share out loud with people. That might be an issue for you and your staff, Tim, to look at, where the Republican votes would cross the impact guns in the hands of mentally ill people. And I don't know what the gun violence reduction would be from that, but if in California we had mental health services and pulled them off the streets and gave them housing in mental facilities, and then the healthcare advocates and organizations behind that, a lot of stakeholders that would help them. That's it.
Yeah, well, thank you, David. I mean, to answer both of those points, just comment on those points really quickly, is that, the governor and the legislature are putting a lot of resources and thought into some of the problems you might have heard in the media is called care court. The idea that we are going to really step in and help those who definitely need the most help. It is not humane to let people suffer and wither away on the street, because right now we have our system, for better or for worse, about rehabilitation and services is you opt in, right? What happens to those smaller section of folks who really do not have the sound of mind to opt in, who are dying on the streets right now? It's a struggle of how do we do with homelessness and a struggle of civil rights, right? Because we also don't want to just jail people who we find unsightly. It's not good either. But it's a fine balance I think we're going to be able to strike. There are bills about conservatorship, care court, and to her credit too, I want to shout out Supervisor Susan Ellenberg, very deliberate about saying as the state figures out these new ideas, we need to provide the funding for the actual facilities right here back at home, because it's we create a lot of new legal pathways for people to get help, but if there's no resources to help people, then we're also in a jam again. So she's been really great at the forefront. I just met with her in Sacramento. She came all the way up here just to lobby all of us, our delegation, about the resources, and it is important. So I think that's a really important point. And to the point about gun violence, of course, it's a huge cross-partisan spectrum that people do not want to have gun violence, right? I mean, just yesterday, our Capitol went into lockdown because someone threatened, after shooting a bunch of places, to come up and shoot the Capitol. And we literally had to cancel floor session really fast. And it's kind of unprecedented how quickly we evacuated. But, luckily, obviously, I'm here, nothing happened. But it's too much of a reality. I think it's like scary to think that it's so often that could happen. And even though we get, as you can imagine, on a regular basis, hundreds of death threats, this one was one of those that really piqued the interest of CHP and our security teams. That was like, okay, this is not good. So it's a reality, and I think the Republican caucus is just freaked out as us. So I think they should hopefully embrace forward-thinking gun control measures.
So I'm intrigued by your mention of social housing in other countries and the history of how it's worked and kept housing prices lower across the income spectrum, from expensive, upper middle class down to the needier housing. How would you pay for that? And wouldn't that have to be statewide to really work?
Yeah, and that's why I'm proposing my bill to have a statewide developer entity. And that's actually what the state is kind of moving towards under this governor too. And I'm trying to fuse our efforts together. So in Sacramento right now, we're under the efforts of what's called the Surplus Lands Act. We're trying to convert, because land is very expensive, of course, in California. We're trying to convert properties owned by the state into housing. So right now what's happening is we are in Sacramento actually could convert the old EDD buildings into housing. The big problem though is we have to do the request for bid. We have to ask a private developer will only build at a certain rate of affordability because they only want that amount to convert those buildings for us. But if we had our own developer entity, we could do that. And now the question of how to pay for it, different countries have different models we can draw upon. But generally, my idea has always been that we can have external stimuli. Like one of my colleagues in the Senate is proposing basically a tax on Airbnb to pay for social housing, which I think is fine. It's just good. But generally, what I think is the bedrock of social housing finance has to be, just like what we do with public construction, is bonds. And then obviously you accumulate revenue from rents or sales of housing, right? Just as the private sector has portfolios where they can subsidize some or lower income folks, and then obviously they have higher income portfolio. That's the idea, is just portfolio management. And that's how we can try to make it self-sustaining from a revenue standpoint, because I don't want it to become like in the US where it's only external input, right? It will never survive on its own. And that leads to a lot of undesirable effects, right? Unintended consequences, where if you concentrate poverty, folks are kind of trapped in a community where they don't have excess funds to do renovations, to paint, do landscaping, right? Just as anyone who owns a home, right? You got to put some money in there to just keep that house nice, right? So you have to keep having that surplus. So my model is about revenue neutrality, keeping money flowing inside the system. And it's going to be a balance of those mixed incomes. But, the forefront for construction, we got bonds, we got other measures, we can do that. And then a fun fact about Vienna styles, because they kind of, and this is what is my bill, it's called cost rental, is basically, I only ask you to pay rent for basically how much it costs upkeep the building. And that results in people's rents actually lowering over time. Because once you pay off the 30-year loans, the capital loans to build apartment buildings or homes, whatever it is, your loan repayment's gone. So now you're only paying for maintenance. And that's a curious factor why a lot of people's rents go down. Obviously, the trade-off is your building is 30, 40 years older than, say, a current one, but it's still in ship shape. You can still create different things. One of the oldest social housing development neighborhoods in Austria. It was built in the 20s, one of their first ones. A lot of people have a lot of strong feelings about it, but the reality is they've now allowed, because they were a little smaller units back then, they allowed their residents to basically knock down walls and they combine the units. And the people there pay a fraction of what it is on their even open Viennese market, Austrian market, a huge fraction of what we have here. So thank you for the question. Yes, Jeff.
In the sentence or in define social housing in the part two, question two is it exclusively government owned property, or are there public private partnership models that we can look at, or how would that look?
Yeah, I would say social housing, as the international definition kind of recognizes it, is government sponsored development, that can take different forms of every government, that is available to all income levels. It's mixed income, it's universal. And from our American definition, it's sustainable environmentally and union built. That's the important part. We have roles for nonprofits to play into it, whether they be, not every nonprofit is a nonprofit developer, let's be clear, right? Some are very focused on tenant rights or property management in that kind of world. And we have a lot of overlap there. Our idea is to have state-sponsored development in complementary with the nonprofit developers too. We have a whole different mission, but also different access of revenue sources and mission. Because the sad reality is, I tell the nonprofit developers all the time, is that we don't have to fight over work, because there's more than enough demand to go around right now, that we all have to be fighting together and building more and more affordable housing together. Yes.
Yeah, can you give us some idea how you are approaching public financing of elections?
Yeah, so right now, my bill is AB 270. This bill lifts the ban. It lifts the ban on public financing in California, which will then go to the ballot. This bill does not prescribe any sort of model that the state will go to, the city will go to. That's more like a 2025 question of what we're going to do. So that's more of a future conversation, but right now we're just trying to lift it so that more experimentation can happen. If that makes sense. Yeah. Yes.
Program called
Climate reality.
Climate Reality, and he has suggestions for state legislatures,
Mm.
things that they can do to help people use the IRA.
Yep.
And they're really great ideas. I want, I can give this to you or someone on your staff. I don't know if it's something you already have. that you're looking at.
I don't have it personally, but you can give it to Tim in the back there, who's on my staff, and I think we'll look at it. Yeah. Yeah, good. Thank you. Thank you for that. Yes, right there.
Housing projects right now are applying for the last round of home key funding, so I'm wondering if there's anything in the works for what's next for state funding to address homelessness.
Well, I will say that specifically when it comes to homelessness, the governor, even though the budget is still ongoing, the governor has proposed $1 billion to fight homelessness, $1 billion. You know, in a budget of $256 billion, a quarter trillion, that seems small, but it is a significant amount of money. I believe that Project Room Key will continue to be a priority for the legislature and the governor. In fact, there's several people, including myself, who are running bills to do what's called adaptive reuse, right? It's turning, same premise, turning hotels, motels into housing, affordable housing for especially folks who are unhoused, because they already kind of come ready to go. So I think this approach is here to stay for a while. The rebound of the tourism industry, obviously, a little bit of a, unfortunately, luckily and unfortunately, right, makes it so that doing this is a little more expensive now, but I still think it's going to be an option on the table continuing going forward. Yeah. Yes.
Congress are say, the national legislature every year. Able to again the excessive compensation of executives. State legislature. Excessive compensation.
Yeah, it's a great question, Karen. So your question was about, there was a congressman from Minnesota who every year would bring a measure to tackle excessive disparity between CEO and employee pay, correct? I believe someone in the legislature actually has done it recently. I have not been the one to do it, unfortunately, but I will say that I do every year what's called the wealth tax. So this is the tax on the unrealized assets of mega millionaires and billionaires. So it's kind of to that point. Because we actually are living now in the era where CEOs, like famously like Mark Zuckerberg, right? They'll say, I only earn like $1. It's because they own everything. They don't need to have salary anymore. And our tax code is very good at picking up people's incomes, capital gains, salary, etc. But once you become Jeff Bezos or Mark Zuckerberg, and you just own things and you borrow against your own wealth, we ignore you basically. You don't exist on tax roll anymore. And that's egregious. So this is the second time I'm doing it. This year, I have a coalition of 8 states together doing a wealth tax on mega millionaires and billionaires. It's modeled after Elizabeth Warren's proposal, if you're familiar with it. And that's basically has been throttled and stalled because unfortunately our governor is very against it. But the state of Washington and the state of Hawaii might actually make a lot of progress this year. We're in our coalition together. So, we have to keep pushing on these things. It's very unpopular because, again, about campaign finance, right? Some of these people are very good friends on text chains with governors and legislators, and they say, hey, I don't want this. I don't want to be taxed more. But we do also have a great cadre of millionaires who also say, hey, you should tax me more because I want to pay a premium to live in a good state. But that's the reality is even CEO disparity pay or it's taxes on the richest rich people in the world, we still get a lot of resistance. Have I answered everyone's questions? Okay, Derek in the back, how about that?
During the height of the pandemic, the governor made the retired people such as myself unlimited in terms of how we can go into schools and support as teachers, administrators, and so forth. Is there any possibility that can be reinstated? Because right now we're still in a shortage situation, and it's impacting the 6 million schools throughout the state of California. And, right now, a lot of subs, people I know myself included, our time is out. And in terms of what we can do in terms of school. And so, but yet there's still school in June. So,
Yeah.
that's when the impact is up, right, even more.
Yeah.
So, governor is even thinking about when you state that unlimited, so that, our school children can have teachers and administrators and custodians and bus drivers for retirement for these, roles.
Yeah, so your question is about retired folks and retired school employees and educators being able to fill in the gap for subbing. Yeah, I would say I'm not sure if that conversation is happening, although I should because I'm on the education committee. I don't know if anyone has proposed this yet, frankly, and I'll have to follow up with you about it because we are suffering a substitute teacher shortage. We're also suffering a regular teacher shortage too. So I think it would be something warranted. I'm not sure exactly where that's at, but it's always a good idea, I think. So let me look into that one for you. I think I saw one question over here. Yes.
Well, there's something of like a communal living model there, and where people would have their own apartment where they would share, like, say, kitchen and a living room area or kind of say, I don't know, these are all together, but
Yeah, your question is about whether there's communal living models out there where, say, people share living quarters together, like the kitchen, stuff like that, shared amenities, right? Yeah. So, well, certainly those models exist out there. It's not super widespread or popular in America, as you can kind of imagine why. But those exist out there. I mean, there are, like, even in San Jose, I think there was one proposed development like that. That it's always an option out there. My idea is always to give people more options, whether they want to live in condo, townhome, single family home, apartment, communal living style. We need to have more choices for people. That's it. That's the bottom line. Yeah. Let's check.
I know there's a place in Portland that does that, mostly with seniors
Mhm.
that are very active, but, but I just wanted to mention that. But my question was gonna be if, there's any city in the US that's doing anything like what you're doing in Indiana. Years ago, I went to Salt Lake City.
Yeah, there's actually quite a few examples in the concerted effort. Social housing, you might notice a theme here. I also work with a lot of other states on this too. Has been most advanced right now in our progress in Maryland. One county, their county state relationship is very different over there. Montgomery County already has like four apartments buildings basically that are social housing funded and created. In Maryland, they're quite successful. In Montgomery County, Hawaii, my other counterpart over there, they actually have a precedent of developing housing, especially for indigenous people or county employees, different set of factors over there, of course, as well. And they already have a model. They're trying to expand that, especially as they build out Honolulu right now to be very dense. And if you've been to Honolulu, there actually are a lot of skyscrapers there, kind of may counter to your imagination, but there are a lot of skyscrapers there. And they've actually already done their zoning wars. Basically, they've basically said anything can be as high as you want, and they still have a housing crisis. So their next approach now is to get into the business of development too. And I would say that Rhode Island is also appropriating the money for it. And then Seattle in February actually just approved by ballot. So the first time in US history, they did it by ballot, a social housing developer, which is what I try to do as legislation. And it passed, even though it had a lot of opposition, it passed with like 8-point advantage. And that was February 2023 in Seattle, but that's a city level, of course. But their state legislators are also very excited for it. They're trying to find money and appropriate it and do things for it. So it is catching on in America, and I think it's going to be more and more so you're going to see in the next decade. Yes.
I have a question about affordable housing. A lot of developers are required to have affordable units in the building. But I've never been able to figure out once that initial person gets planted with it, how does it stay affordable? Or does it go up to market prices? So it's after one owner, it's no longer affordable.
Yeah, your question is about affordable units, especially when they're in kind of a mixed situation, right? Where there's some units set aside to be affordable and then the rest for, say, market rate. So by law, depends on the jurisdiction. Again, we don't have a uniform state standard. The typical kind of mix is, say, like 10% of the units are set aside to be affordable housing. So say you get 100 units, 10%, 10 of them are affordable. And your question is, how does that stay affordable? Generally speaking, is they basically have to lease that out at a certain rent, right? So they, I don't want to get too much like the weeds of it, but basically they say, this is the rent we will set for people who are qualified incomes. So as say that tenant moves out, the new tenant comes in, they have to qualify. So it's all means tested and that's how it stays, but it only has to stay for certain couple decades. It's not unlimited for it.
So it only applies for rental units and not ownership units?
There are schemes in which you also do for ownership. So that would be, usually they're called more so below market rate. So say even for example, in the city of Milpitas, where I grew up, they just offered, and it was a kind of, they're single family homes. They offered a small subsection, and then some of those were for qualified buyers of certain income, and it was lottery system. Funny enough, my friend from high school got it. She actually was the one who could afford it, and guess what? It was still $800,000, but that's below market rate for you in Milpitas. But that it still extends for sale units too. I mean, it's just different schemes that exist. Yeah. Okay, all the way in the back.
Social housing, the person that occupies the property, that they have a right to sell, or is it owned by the government, or is there a price control?
Yeah, so and of course I'm very glad there's so much engagement about social housing. I could literally talk for 3 hours about social housing, about all sorts of things. Is that so in social housing, in the bill that we propose, there's two models. There's the typical rental model where if you're just interested in year by year leasing, that's fine. Or we adopted what the Singaporeans have, is called a 99-year lease, which is an effective ownership. You are entitled to transfer to your family members upon, something happens to you, you die or something like that, which is like a home. And you can also sell it under limits, right, for appreciation as well. It's not going to be probably as high appreciation as if you're out there in the market with your own home, but you're enabled to do these things too. Of course, you can't, in a strict rental model, you're not, if you pass away, you're not allowed to just give it away to your children, and you can't sell it. So we have two different models here. Singapore has this, and it's most people also wealth build through this too. I mean, 84% of the population of 5 million people in Singapore do this, and they live there. And it's a really nice way to have a stable appreciation. It's not a get rich quick, even in a generation kind of scheme, but it is stable appreciation. One more question. Who shall be the lucky last question? Here you, or well, whoever would like to hint, or okay.
They're very minutes inside.
Yeah.
This law on preventing public funding of helping votes, with elections come from, right? I mean,
Yeah. It was part of a 1970s ballot proposition, which Craig actually knows really well about too, is it was snuck in basically. I believe that, okay, to get into a little bit of the political policy history of it, it was part of the Fair Political Practice Act, which laid out a lot of great things in there, right? And there was one section that said you may not use public funds, state money for elections. And I believe it should be interpreted to mean no embezzlement, right? Like you obviously don't want to like take that and embezzle. But that was quite clear to us. So we actually, this is actually when I was still a staffer, Senator Allen tried to lift the ban just by a bill, right? Just to do it straight by a bill. And then the courts struck it down. The court said, this is not in furtherance of the Fair Political Practice Act because it said so-and-so, and the voters need to decide. And we disagree with that sentiment, but the courts upheld it. So now we have to go this way and then put it on the ballot. So it's one of those things where it's like the Fair Political Practice Act also has a lot of great, I think that era has a lot of great laws, which are really great sounding, but decades on later, when I'm trying to do a more inclusive democracy, you'd be surprised how many times I try to do something and it says, oh, a ballot measure says I can't do that explicitly. So it happens quite often. So my belief is back then, they hopefully weren't trying to prevent publicly financed elections, although I think certain proponents in there made me argue that. But whoever took it to court in 2016 definitely argued that, and they said, hey, no public money whatsoever. And the court sided with them. It's kind of ridiculous because we were also allowed as legislature to amend the Fair Political Practice Act. And we did everything. It was a 2/3 vote. We had super much. We had bipartisan support for this. And they still said that's not good enough. You have to take it to the voters, and which of course is expensive, but it's also good. Builds more awareness about public finance elections and take it for what it is, right? So that's why we have to do this. So
That be on the ballot soon?
we're hoping for it to be in 2024 to be on the ballot. 2024 is gonna be a big one. I think I alone have helped or will put on like 4 measures that are on the ballot. So there'll be a lot on there. Yeah. So thank you so much for your thoughtful questions. Thank you for having me.